is by Peter Singer, who is professor of DeCamp Professor of Bioethics in Princeton University. Peter Singer is an Australian by birth, educated at the University of Melbourne and then at the University of Oxford. He came to Princeton in 1999 from Monash University in Melbourne, and at the time he came, probably many of you remember, there was a great deal of controversy, but he has been described as, in the New Yorker, as perhaps the most controversial philosopher alive, but certainly the most influential. Peter Singer is a prolific writer, and rather than take up all of the evening telling you his publications, I'll just read to you a small number of them. The book that first brought him to worldwide attention was a book called Animal Liberation. But then he wrote Democracy and Disobedience, Practical Ethics, The Expanding Circle, Marx, Hegel, The Reproduction Revolution, How Are We to Live, Rethinking Life and Death. His works appear in 20 languages, and he's the author of the major article on ethics in the current edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica. Peter, I have a question for you. Was One World published this year?
No, it was published at the end of 2002.
Okay. So there are only 2 books this year.
I've been slacking.
Thus far this year, he has written a very moving, interesting, personal book about his grandfather. It's called Pushing Time Away, My Grandfather and the Tragedy of Jewish Vienna. And he has also written a more public book called The President, The Convenient Ethics of George W. Bush.
If I can make a slight correction, that was the subtitle the publisher wanted. I never wanted the word convenient, and it doesn't have the word convenient.
Oh, it doesn't?
The full title is The President of Good and Evil, The Ethics of George W. Bush. I don't want to slant it one way or the other.
Editorial comment came from me. Peter, it's your show.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the introduction. So probably you'll be disappointed if you're wanting a taste of what is supposed to have made me one of the most controversial philosophers, because I don't think what I'm saying today is all that controversial, though it may be in some circles. And unfortunately, it's also probably not an area in which I'm all that influential, though I wish I were more influential in this area. I'm talking about ethics and globalization, which is a large topic, and I'm actually probably using it in a slightly broader sense than most people would imagine. When we talk about globalization today, we usually have in mind issues relating to the World Trade Organization, to the idea in which we're becoming one economy, to questions about outsourcing, which have just been reasonably current issues of discussion, and that range of issues to do with the events that happened, I guess, that triggered the debate in Seattle in 1999 at the ministerial meeting of the World Trade Organization, which put these questions very much on the public agenda, and the series of other protests and demonstrations that have taken place since then in various other parts of the world. Well, that's certainly one of the issues about globalization that I think does raise ethical questions, and I'm not going to ignore it, but I want to look at a wider range of issues that includes other questions that raise the issue of to what extent are we really one world, and to what extent should we strive to become one world as an ethical community, and perhaps even in some sense as a political community, rather than simply the sort of de facto economic linking of the economy that we've talked about. So, as well as issues to do with trade then, I want to talk about questions like the importance of state sovereignty, or the weakening of state sovereignty perhaps, and also questions about the issue of sharing the world's atmosphere. In other words, the issue of global warming, which I think is a sort of paradigm example of the way in which we need to work as one world, as one ethical community. And also I'll talk a little bit about foreign aid and what our obligations are there. So obviously to get through that in a reasonable time means that I have to move fairly fast. But I hope I'll be able to say something that will give you the sense of why these are ethical issues. Because that's obviously my take on it. I mean, I'm not an economist, I'm not an expert in international law, but I think all of these issues raise ethical questions. And indeed, that's been acknowledged on some of these issues, even by those who don't see eye to eye with me. One of the things that led me to have a look at the ethics of George W. Bush was listening to the presidential debates in 2000 and listening to statements like this one. So this is Bush asked about whether he was going to sign the Kyoto Protocol, and he says, "I'll tell you one thing I'm not going to do is I'm not going to let the United States carry the burden for cleaning up the world's air, like the Kyoto Treaty would have done. China and India were exempted from that treaty. I think we need to be more even-handed." So there's a clear appeal to fairness here that the then candidate, now president, is making. He's suggesting that it's not fair for the United States to carry the burden of cleaning up the world's atmosphere when China and India are exempted from it. So what I want to start off doing is to look at that as an ethical question. Why is it an ethical question? Well, I think Bush is right to say that there is an issue of fairness involved in what is to be done with the problem of climate change. Essentially, it's not that different from the classic problem of fairness that philosophers talk about, and for that matter that we talk about with our children when we try and get across the concept of fairness. That is, suppose you have a pie and you have you and 9 other hungry friends, and you've got to divide up the pie. How do you do it? Why is the problem of that sort? It's not exactly the same, obviously. Why is it of that sort? It's because we have a limited resource. The limited resource here is the capacity of the atmosphere to absorb our waste gases without producing consequences that no one wants. Those consequences, for example, could be not only a rise in temperatures, but greater fluctuations in rainfall in some parts of the world, perhaps, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, where people are already trying to eke a living from fairly arid regions, and rainfalls could become more variable there or disappear, with obvious consequences for whether people can get enough to eat. Another predicted consequence of global warming is a rise in sea levels as the ice caps melt, and that could have dire consequences for people living close to sea level, wherever they might be. Could be in Florida, could be in the Bay of Bengal, for example, where tens of millions of Bengalis grow their food on very low-lying but very fertile delta lands, which already are subject to inundation when there are unusually high tides combined with storms in the Bay of Bengal. So it wouldn't take much of a sea level rise to to have catastrophic consequences there. So if we assume that these are things that, that we don't want to occur, then it seems that there's a very limited amount of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide basically and some others, that we can put into the atmosphere. So the atmosphere becomes the pie, or the capacity of the atmosphere to absorb these gases becomes the pie. And the question is, well, how should we divide it up, given that nobody owns it? It's a common resource in that sense. But there are a variety of approaches we can take to this question. One question that you might ask about how you divide up a pie, I suppose, is, well, who made the pie? Who bought the ingredients for the pie? So sometimes, for arguments about fairness, you want to ask historical questions. And sometimes you want to ask other questions like, well, who's hungry and who would benefit from getting a slice of pie? So we can do that either way in the case of climate change. We can look at the historical question, in which case the question is not so much who baked it, in the sense of who gets the credit for having created this good, but rather who has created the situation where we have a problem with this. In other words, who has already made use of this scarce resource. And here's a graph. I couldn't get a really up-to-date one, unfortunately. It only goes up to 1995, but I don't think the broad proportions will be very different, showing this. Now, there are two columns, actually, here. If we ask the historical question, that is, who created this problem, then it's this chart that we need to look at, the historical one, the stock contribution. The relevant fact to know here, of course, is that once you put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, it stays there for quite a long time. The emissions that were put out by Henry Ford's first Model T are still up there in the atmosphere. So that means that it's significant as to who industrialized first and who has had the longest use of the atmosphere for putting out these greenhouse gases. And that's why this chart shows that the developed nations, which of course only have about a quarter of the world's population, are responsible for something in excess of 80% of the greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere now. That's clearly going to be relevant to any decision about whether it's fair or not for the developed nations to carry the principal burden of dealing with the problem. Even if you look at what the current situation is, as of 1995 anyway, you find that the developed nations are still responsible for each year putting about 60% of the total annual emissions. That might have slipped a little bit because China and India have certainly increased their emissions, probably somewhat more than the developed nations on the whole, but it won't be very different. So that's one way of looking at the issue, to say, okay, you have an issue of fairness, use of a scarce resource that we all have in common, and one way of looking at it would be to say, well, when we deal with pollution issues, we say the polluter should pay. The person who did the polluting is the one who should carry the burden for fixing the problem. Here you can't actually, as far as we now have the technology, you can't actually fix the problem in terms of soaking up carbon from the atmosphere, although there are some scientists at this university who are currently working on trying to develop methods of doing that, but at the moment it's simply not economically feasible to do so. But so the best thing you can do to fix it is to clamp down on present emissions and see how much you can do with that. That's one way of looking at the issue. Another way of looking at it, as I said, would be to say, well, you have this pie, you might say, well, okay, let's not worry too much about who produced it. People might say that's a complicated story. The developed nations didn't know the damage they were doing for most of that period where they built up the stock of greenhouse gases. So suppose that you wipe the slate clean and start again. You still have, obviously, this disproportionate input. And you have to say, well, what would be a fair input under these circumstances? One way of approaching that, of course, would be to say, well, nobody has a better claim to use the atmosphere than anyone else. It's a common resource. We're all inhabitants of the world, residents of the world. So why not just say everybody has an equal share to the atmosphere? So you could then do this kind of calculation. You could say, how much do we think we need to reduce emissions? And let's set a total. And in fact, there was a long process of negotiations that led to the Kyoto Protocol, which did set a kind of desirable total. It was an average of 5% below the 1990 levels of emissions. And you could take that total and then you could say, divide it by the number of people in the world, and you'll get a notional per capita entitlement. And then for each nation, you multiply it by the population of that nation, and then you have a national entitlement. Well, how does that work out for the developed nations, or more specifically for the United States? The answer, of course, is not very well. As you can see from that column there, the developed nations, with a quarter of the world's population, are each year producing about 60% of the emissions. And the United States, with only 5% of the world's population, is producing about 30% of the world's emissions, almost half of the developed nations' total. So if you were to go for equal per capita shares, the reduction that the United States would have to make would be incredibly drastic. It would be down to about 1/6 of what it currently is. That compares with what Bush has refused to sign on in Kyoto, which is a reduction to 7% below 1990 levels, which on current levels might be a reduction of about 20%. Nothing like a reduction to just 1/6 of what we are now. So there's another possible principle of fairness, which suggests that, in fact, the Kyoto Protocol was leaning over very far backwards to be fair to the United States, that it could have been much more drastic on the United States. Another issue, another way of looking at fairness is to look at it not on an equal per capita share, but on the basis of need. As I said, dividing up the apple pie, who's hungrier, who's closer to the borderline of malnutrition, and you might decide that you want to give them a larger share of the pie. That's a plausible principle of justice, distribution according to need. Again, it's a very unfavourable one for the United States, because the United States, a lot of its emissions are, of course, luxury emissions. They come from things like motor vehicles, which the developing nations don't even have to anything like the extent that we have. And yet, when there's a suggestion of a cutback, the Bush administration has said, we can't do that. Here's Ari Fleischer, the former president's spokesperson, asked about whether the president would call on drivers to sharply reduce their fuel consumption. He says, that's a big no. The president believes that it's an American way of life, and that it should be the goal of policymakers to protect the American way of life. The American way of life is a blessed one. So I think that basically says what the president thinks, or at least if his spokesperson has quoted him accurately, about this question of need. We have other people who are at a far lower level of welfare, who may need to increase their greenhouse gas emissions in order to industrialise to a greater extent, in order to come closer to our standard of living, and perhaps therefore to be able to feed their people in a better way and provide more of their basic needs. And yet if they do so, of course, we will have a further drastic increase in emissions, which could only happen safely if there is a corresponding cut from the developed nations. But if the developed nations are not prepared to do so, then that's going to lead to disaster. And of course, it's the United States that's been the principal holdout on this. The other major industrialized nations have agreed to sign on. Russia is still prevaricating, hasn't really come down definitively, and so the treaty has not actually come into effect, but with the exception of Russia, which I think clearly would sign on if the United States would, because they're saying, well, why should we do it when the US won't? It's the US that's been the principal obstacle. So there's one global ethical issue, as I see it, where we're clearly going down the wrong path, and I think a path that cannot be justified by any defensible principle of ethics. Okay, let me move to the economic issues that I mentioned before have been discussed a lot under the heading of globalization. What should we think about the attempt to bring the world's economy closer together through through reducing trade barriers? First thing to say about this, by the way, is that to some extent it seems to be less of an immediate practical issue than it was at the time when I was researching and writing One World in 2000-2001, because things have stalled to a significant extent since then. We've had the failure of the Cancun ministerial meeting to make further breakthroughs, and that I think was to some extent due to the fact that some of the developing nations are taking a harder line in negotiations. They are standing up for themselves because they think that the way in which the trade negotiations have been conducted up to the Seattle meeting anyway have not really been ones that have been fair to their interests. So let's just ask that question very briefly. Are there also issues of fairness here, and are they, as sometimes claimed, ones in which the developed nations have taken advantage of the developing nations in trade terms? There are a lot of different factual issues here that you have to try and get a grip on before you can really deal with this. Because part of the argument, of course, of those who are advocating trade liberalisation is that this actually is the best way to help the poorer nations of the world to rise out of their poverty. By becoming part of the world economy, they can shake off poverty, they can trade their way out of the poverty in which they now exist. Against that, opponents of trade liberalisation have said that that's not what's been happening. They've maintained that actually the opening up of the world's economy has caused the gap between rich and poor nations to widen rather than to narrow. So what are the facts about this? It's actually not as easy to find out what they are as you might think. They're somewhat in dispute, and it depends also here to a degree on your ethical values. Because when you say, for example, has trade liberalisation been a good thing or a bad thing for the world as a whole, are you interested in whether the gap between the rich and poor nations has widened? Because that's the argument that's often presented, and it's assumed then that that's a bad thing, that if you agree that the gap between rich and poor nations has widened, then you should reject economic liberalisation. Or are you interested in whether the poorer people in the world have got better off or not? Okay? Because it's possible that both things are true. It's possible that the gap between the richest nations and the poorest nations has widened, and that the poorest nations have become better off. Obviously that can happen if the poorest nations become just a little bit better off and the rich nations become a lot better off. Then the gap will widen. But you might well think that's still a good thing. If the poorest nations have become even a little bit better off, isn't that good? And, you know, why should we be troubled by the fact that the richer nations have become a lot better off? Surely that's not a bad thing for people to become better off, as long as they're not harming others by doing it. So that's one of the issues, you know, do you support overall welfare and overall rise in utility, as a utilitarian would, or do you think that equality is important in itself, even so that widening a widening gap is bad even when the poor become better off. Personally, I'm not an egalitarian in that absolute sense that says that even if everyone gets better off, an increase in inequality is a bad thing. I'd rather take the rise in overall welfare, including the welfare of the poorest, at the cost of, if it's a cost at all, of a greater gap. So we can, I think, put aside the argument about a widening gap and say, let's not worry about that. Let's look at what's happened to the poorest people in the world. But even there, the question is a little more complicated. Because if you ask, well, during the era of economic liberalisation, have the poorest people in the world become better off or worse off? We still have a vagueness that affects the answer. What do we mean by the poorest people in the world? Do we mean, let's say, the poorest third of the world's population? We have a world population of around 6 billion. Do we mean the poorest 2 billion? Or do we mean perhaps the poorest 10%? That is the very poorest 600 million in the world. And I think, as far as you can tell, because as I say, the figures are not very good, mostly they're based on national income averages. And national income averages, of course, can cover up a lot of inequality within a nation. But as far as we can tell, the figures suggest that, yes, the poorest third of the world has generally become better off, whereas the poorest tenth of the world has not become better off. That's partly because if you're talking about the poorest third of the world, and say if you go back 20 years, a lot of the poorest third of the world is made up by a large number of people in China and a substantial number of people in India. And those two nations have become better off in the last 20 years, particularly China, but more recently a substantial slice of the population of India as well. So you could say that economic liberalisation has helped the poorer third of the world, but it doesn't seem to have helped the poorest tenth. Most of those people are in sub-Saharan Africa. They're in countries that have not really been able to get into the global trade picture very much. Of course, they've also been affected by HIV/AIDS, which is a tragedy that's not directly linked to globalisation, but it does seem that they've not really benefited. So that requires you to make a further judgment. I think that, I guess, my personal take on this, for what it's worth, perhaps not very much, is that economic liberalisation probably has been a good thing on the whole, because it has helped more than 1 billion people who are in that poorest third, although not in the poorest tenth, and that's significant. And I'm not persuaded that it's really made the poorest tenth worse off. It's very difficult to isolate the factors there, but I think it would be difficult to argue that it has. So to that extent, you could say it's not been a bad thing, but it certainly is true, I think, that it is not really being carried through fairly, and therefore it could be a much better thing. And that's, I think, what the breakdown in talks at Cancun was really about. It was about the fact that the liberalisation so far has been much more in respect of manufactured goods and financial services and things of that sort, which have been situations where the developed nations have been eager to push through liberalisation, and it's been much less in agriculture, which is where the developed nations have been much more protectionist, and are still being much more protectionist. Protectionist both in not opening up their markets to the developing world on a free basis, and also in subsidising their own agricultural products, which means that it's much harder for the developing nations to compete with them on global markets. You might have noticed a bit of discussion in the media about this around the time of the Cancun meeting. One particularly glaring example that was talked about was American subsidies for cotton producers. American cotton producers are actually much less efficient than cotton producers in some of Africa's poorest nations, like Mali or Burkina Faso. The African cotton producers can produce a pound of cotton more cheaply than the American cotton producers. But they can't sell it on the global market because the American cotton producers are so heavily subsidised that they can sell their cotton for only 57% of what it costs them to produce it and still make a living from it. And of course, the producers of Mali or Burkina Faso can't do that, so they can't compete. So the United States is effectively subsidising about 25,000 cotton growers whose average net worth is, according to one study that I saw, around $800,000. At the cost of depriving a very much larger number of peasant cotton growers in these nations from the opportunity to earn a decent income when they are in fact more or less on the breadline. They're struggling to produce enough to feed their families. So I think that this is a clear example of where, despite a lot of talk about free trade and despite a lot of talk from this administration and from the Clinton administration itself in the past about this, the United States has not lived up to its promises of really saying, well, you know, if we believe in free trade, if we believe in open competition, we should be ensuring the efficiency of our producers by letting them make their own way in global markets, and if they can't make their own way, then we should do something else. We can find other things to do which we're more efficient at. So there's a lot more to be said about that issue, but not to dwell on it too long. I think that economic globalisation can be a good thing, but for it to be a good thing, it should be carried out fairly. I think there is a legitimate complaint from a lot of developing countries that the present system of economic globalisation has not been a fair one. Okay, let me turn to the third of the issues that I want to talk about. That's the question of the role of national sovereignty, and the converse of that is the role of international institutions in moving towards globalisation, in developing towards one world. And this is obviously an issue that's there have been a lot of developments over the last few years, but let's go back to the end of the Second World War. At the end of the Second World War, the victors did something unusual. They decided to put the Nazi leadership, or those that they could find, on trial, not only for waging war, for a war of aggression, but also for the crimes of genocide and crimes against humanity. And that was a novelty because it suggested that even though these people had been acting in conformity with the law of their land, there was an international law that they had violated and against which they could be held responsible and properly punished. So the Nuremberg Tribunal created a precedent for the idea that there is an international law against committing certain types of crimes, and that state sovereignty, national sovereignty, was not a defence for those crimes. Nothing very much happened with that precedent for quite a long time, essentially because of the Cold War and the fact that whether the Soviet bloc or the United States and NATO allies would accuse one or the other of committing crimes or doing something like that, but it would be, no doubt, vetoed by the other side. Cooperation was not going to work. And then in the 1990s, a variety of events occurred which raised the issue again of limits to national sovereignty and the role of the international community. In fact, some of these events had happened before the 1990s, but didn't really make much of a precedent because they didn't involve the major powers. The issue that I'm talking about here is the idea of nations intervening in the affairs of others to prevent crimes against humanity. Not simply to put on trial people who'd committed those crimes, but actually to stop them before they happen, which obviously is better than just punishing the guilty afterwards. So the events that really brought this to global attention were the genocide in Rwanda, where there was a failure to intervene, and as a result of that failure to intervene, perhaps 800,000 people were murdered, and most people think that could have been stopped by a relatively small number of troops if they had intervened in a timely fashion. And then subsequently the developments in the breakup of Yugoslavia, in Bosnia, and also later in Kosovo. So what these events seemed to establish was the idea that the international community was prepared to support a right of humanitarian intervention in some circumstances. As I said, it didn't happen in Rwanda, but a lot of people afterwards thought that it should have happened. Kofi Annan, who had a role in it not happening, in that he was not Secretary General at the time, but he was involved in the Africa desk, and perhaps himself regretted not having taken firmer and more prompt action. Also, President Clinton, who was president at the time, did not do anything. In fact, the United States actively worked against intervention by refusing to allow the word genocide to be used in discussions at the United Nations. But Clinton later regretted that and went to Rwanda and acknowledged that he thought perhaps the greatest mistake of his presidency was not what he might have done with an intern, but his failure to intervene in a much more tragic situation in Rwanda. And then, of course, he did intervene in former Yugoslavia, no doubt worried that he would be making the same sort of mistake again. And subsequent to that, the United Nations has set up ad hoc tribunals to try people for these crimes. There are tribunals working in Rwanda. Of course, Milosevic is on trial in The Hague, and other Serbian accused war criminals have been tried as well. So what's happening here is a piecemeal development of international law, which a large number of nations decided to formalise and make permanent by setting up something called the International Criminal Court. And that has now come into operation. About 90 nations have signed on, and they are recognising that there are certain crimes that should be regarded as crimes against international law, and they are agreeing that nobody accused of these crimes by the prosecutor's office of the International Criminal Court shall have refuge on their territory. They'll hand them over to the International Criminal Court if they're charged with crimes, and they will not waive any kind of immunity for their own citizens in these circumstances. And I think that's a very positive development towards bringing about the beginnings of an international law which will set up a global legal community, at least against these particular crimes. It's interesting that so far terrorism has not been listed as a crime under the International Criminal Court, but it's one of the things that has been on the agenda to discuss. The reason it wasn't listed was that the definition of terrorism turned out to be difficult, and so those talks kind of broke down some time back. But it's clearly something that the court could take up, and that one would think that the United States in particular would have a great interest in getting the court to take up. However, the attitude of the United States has been anything but positive towards that. Clinton actually signed the treaty just before the end of his presidency, but did not attempt to submit it for ratification. It would not have got ratified by the Senate, given what members of the Senate had said about it. And Bush actually withdrew the United States signature from it, a very unusual thing to do. Usually people just sort of don't ratify and let it lapse, but in this case, Bush actually withdrew the United States signature from it, and has been negotiating bilateral treaties with nations where American servicemen are stationed, seeking their undertaking that they will provide immunity from the International Criminal Court for American personnel, and threatening to withdraw American aid or support if they don't do so. This seems to me to be going exactly in the opposite direction. If the United States is about the rule of law, then surely it should welcome the development of the rule of law at an international level. Of course, what was said was that the procedures of the International Court might be used for political purposes, and that the procedures of due process were not the same as those guaranteed in the United States Constitution. They weren't absolutely identical to those guaranteed in the United States Constitution, but they were fairly close to it, and I think they gave somewhat similar safeguards to the accused. Certainly guaranteed access to a lawyer and open public trial and so on. And it's rather ironic that after rejecting the International Criminal Court for those reasons, the Bush administration is now keeping about 600 people in detention at Guantanamo without giving them access to a lawyer. I think perhaps a small number have been allowed some very limited access to a lawyer, but is saying that it will try them, or some of them, by military tribunals, which certainly do not have anything like the due process guarantees that the International Criminal Court has. So it definitely seems a case of double standards if the United States is saying the International Criminal Court is not good enough, but the military tribunals that it will set up will be good enough for those that the United States suspects of some kinds of crimes. So that's one international law issue. The other international law issue, of course, is when humanitarian intervention is justified. And that's been part of the discussion about intervention in Iraq, although, of course, the debate before the war actually began was really about weapons of mass destruction and the threat Iraq allegedly posed, not about humanitarian intervention. But just focusing on the issue of humanitarian intervention, it's now been said, and it perhaps was said at the time by Tony Blair rather more than by George Bush, that that was an important reason for why the war was justified. I think, I support the view that national sovereignty is not absolute, and that the removal of brutal dictators who are committing crimes against their people can be justified. But I also strongly support the idea that there should be international procedures to decide when that should be done. And I think that if nations think that some particular dictator is such a monster that they ought to be removed, and that they can be removed at a cost which is proportional to the benefits that will be gained by freeing his people from that dictatorship, then that should be something that is done through the United Nations Security Council. I'm not saying the United Nations is a perfect body. I don't think it is. I think, for example, that the fact that some nations have a veto is something that should be changed. I think that instead of a veto, you should perhaps have a special majority, a 2/3 or 3/4 majority required to obtain action. I also think that it's wrong to have as permanent members the nations that happen to be on the victorious side at the end of the Second World War, and therefore to leave out major nations like India or Brazil or Indonesia. So I think the Security Council should be reformed, but I think it would have been much better for the United States to work at reforming the Security Council and getting its support for the removal of whatever dictators fit that picture of committing large-scale crimes against their own people and being in a situation where one could hope that a intervention at relatively modest human cost could remove them and provide a better form of government. And those procedures, of course, were not followed in the face of the war in Iraq. So that's the third of the issues about national sovereignty. And as I say, what I would like to see us gradually move towards is an increase in the authority of the United Nations, perhaps a reformed United Nations, perhaps even a more democratic United Nations, in which rather than just having, say, in the General Assembly, one vote, one nation, so that China with over 1 billion people has one vote and Iceland with 280,000 people has one vote, we could have some proportional representation, proportional to population, and then we would actually have something like a global parliament, at least as long as the nations would permit their representatives to be democratically elected. I think that could be a useful force for democracy if that were a requirement. That might seem utopian, perhaps it is at this stage. Certainly the world hasn't moved in that direction in the last 4 years, but you know, I think it's an ideal that we should at least hold up. Finally, I want to say a little bit about foreign aid, because I think if we think of ourselves as one world, then we should think that when we talk about helping the poor, we should not limit ourselves to the poor in our own country. We have schemes, they're not particularly admirable in this country, I think, they're not adequate, but we have schemes that provide some sorts of minimal support for the nation's poorest people. We give them food stamps or some kind of relief. They can get Medicaid if they can't otherwise afford healthcare, and so on. It's modest, it's not good enough, but it's still they get something. But if we're thinking of ourselves as one world, as a global community, we need to think about the world's poorest people, where the gap is actually much wider, and where what we can do in terms of our purchasing power, our ability to assist, is vastly greater than what we can do for poor people in this country. In other words, what I'm saying is, when you have people who are living on the equivalent in purchasing power of $1 US per day, which might actually mean at current foreign exchange rates they're living on a lot less than $1 US per day, then it's easy to see that we can make a huge difference to what they have. And the nations of the world came together at the Millennium Summit in New York in 2000 to accept a certain set of goals for cutting poverty in half by 2012, I think the date was, if I remember correctly, 2015 perhaps it was, to provide safe water for most of the world's poor, to greatly increase the number of people who had access to education for their children, and so on. But we haven't lived up to these goals as yet. We haven't really made the commitments that we would need to do it. Now, a lot of people think that the United States is a very generous nation in terms of foreign aid. Here are some studies that were done. Just adjust this a little. Okay, see that? I can't see it quite yet.
Could you make it higher?
Yeah. I wanted to keep that covered. Okay. So what we're talking about here, this is these are surveys carried out by the Program on International Policy Attitudes, where people were asked what they thought of as foreign aid, what they thought of it as a percentage of the federal budget. Actually, let me just go back a step here. Before they were asked this question, but I haven't got a slide of that, they were asked whether they thought the United States gives about the right amount of foreign aid, or too much, or too little. And a large proportion of people said that they thought the United States gives too much foreign aid. It's actually swung a little bit over the years, and it's swung back in the direction of now about 50% thinks that it's about right. But for many years, more than 50% thought that the United States gave too much foreign aid. They were then asked what percentage of the federal budget, this is of what the government spends. You sometimes see figures quoted in terms of percentage of gross domestic product, and I'm going to give you those figures too. But what percentage of the federal budget do they think goes on foreign aid? Right? And these are the answers in a number of different surveys. In 95, okay, let me just, actually, let's ignore this one for the moment, we'll cover that one too. And this one, okay, so this is what they thought was being given. In two surveys in 95, the median figure was 15% and 20%. In a 96 survey, it was 20%. And in a 2000 survey, it was again 20%. So that's how much of the federal budget people thought went on foreign aid. They were then asked how much they thought should go on foreign aid. So that's what these boxes are, right? Their preferred preferences. And since, as I said, a lot of people thought that we give too much, that's why these green towers are not as high as the red towers. So people thought that we should give about 10% in most of the surveys for the federal budget on foreign aid. What this shows is, of course, that people are amazingly ignorant of what the United States actually does give on foreign aid, because there's the actual figure, the proportion of the federal budget. And in fact, it's actually slightly less than 1%, I think, at present, because the federal budget has gone up a bit since that was done, and foreign aid has not really gone up. Although, you know, give credit where it's due, President Bush has said that he does want to increase foreign aid and has asked Congress for some increases. They would not raise this percentage from very much from 1%. They might raise it to at the most 1.5% over a 5-year period if everything that Bush talked about in his State of the Union address is actually allocated. So, so there's a question of misperceptions here about how much the United States actually gives. And in terms of those amounts that, as I said, would be required to meet the Millennium Development Goals, the World Bank estimated that about 60 billion a year from all of the donor nations would probably make it possible to meet those development goals if that was given up to 2015. Now, 60 billion seems like a lot of money until you remember, of course, that President Bush, for example, asked for an additional allocation after March of last year, an additional allocation of 87 billion for military and reconstruction purposes in Iraq alone. So that's what the United States is putting into one relatively small nation, and that's just the United States. The United States would not, of course, have to contribute the whole 60 billion. We could assume that the nations of Europe would give a substantial part of that. So it's not really that much. It compares, for example, with the Pentagon's budget, which I think is currently running at 457 billion a year. So the United States share of 60 billion wouldn't be that much. How generous, though, is the United States as compared with other nations? That's another question you might ask. You might say, well, even if it's only 1% of the federal budget, we have a big federal budget and a big economy. Here's a nation that does very well in terms of foreign aid. You probably can't see that, so I'm going to walk you through it. This is a chart from the OECD. You can see it, it's on the web, for Denmark. Denmark actually is the nation that gives the largest percentage of its gross domestic product to foreign aid. That is, of everything that the nation earns. Of every $100 that Denmark earns, or 100 crowns or whatever they are, Denmark gives one of them in foreign aid. 1% of its budget goes in foreign aid. Here's the, well, actually it dropped slightly in 2002 to 0.96, but virtually 1%. The next thing to look at is where does it go? Well, a large part of it goes to the least developed countries. This quadrant here is the least developed countries. About a third of all of its budget is going to the least developed countries. Other lower middle income countries is here. So almost 2/3 of it is going to the poorer countries of the world. And here you can see the top recipients: Tanzania, Vietnam, Uganda, Mozambique, Ghana, Bangladesh. They're all nations that are certainly among the poorest nations of the world. So that's a country with a good record. A number of other European nations are not very different. Sweden, the Netherlands, for example, come out pretty similar. If you look at the larger European economies like France and Germany, they're at about 0.4%. The UN target, you might remember, is 0.7%. So here's the United States for comparison. And the first thing you'll see, except you can't see probably just too far away, is the percentage of gross domestic product that goes on foreign aid is 0.13%. In other words, it's about a seventh of what Denmark gives, less than a seventh of what Denmark is giving. It's 13 cents in every $100 that this nation earns goes for foreign aid. It's very little. Secondly, where does it go? Well, the number one recipient is Egypt. There's no way that Egypt is among the poorest nations of the world. It's not a wealthy nation. But it's clearly going for strategic reasons. It's to keep Egypt on side in Middle East peace discussions. We can skip Russia and Israel because that actually doesn't count as foreign aid. They get a lot of overseas assistance, but it's not foreign aid. You can't, it doesn't count as foreign aid because they're not in the poorer nations of the world at all. The next one is Pakistan, which again has obviously gone up a lot recently for strategic reasons. Serbia and Montenegro, tiny percentage of the world's population, part of the assistance that's going into stabilising former Yugoslavia. Colombia is to do with the drug wars. Ukraine is official assistance again. Then we get Jordan, another Middle East nation. You have to get down to the 9th on the list before you get a nation that you might say is arguably something to do with poverty, and even then Peru would be an odd choice. Not one sub-Saharan nation is among the top 10 of the recipients of United States aid. So I think that we have a lamentable record in terms of giving out foreign aid, and this is something that I find when I talk about it with my students that surprises them, and Princeton students ought to be among the better educated young people in America. If not, there's something wrong with our selection process. So you know, it's puzzling, and I think that it's a failure of the electoral system that this is never an issue that I see significantly discussed in electoral politics. It doesn't really seem to make the radar screen in terms of what the candidates really asked to talk about. And so nothing very much changes. As I say, I think it's good that Bush has at least drawn a bit of attention to that. He's done more in that respect than Clinton did, and has said that he wants to increase foreign aid. I hope that he does. And he's also suggested that nations need to meet some standards in order to receive foreign aid so that it's used effectively. That's also something else that I wholeheartedly support. But at the moment, given this lamentable situation, I think there's a responsibility on each of us as citizens of a wealthy nation, and particularly as I take it I'm addressing citizens who are among the relatively better off half of that affluent nation, not likely to be close to the poverty line. I think it's incumbent on us to actually do something about it ourselves. And of course there are a lot of NGOs that can take our donations and do something to increase the amount of aid that goes to the poorest countries of the world. They are actually more efficient than governments at getting aid to the right people. And so I think that if we're frustrated by this situation of the failure of our nation and to a lesser degree perhaps some of the other developed nations of the world to really do what's required to help to create one world in the sense of one world of concern for the poorest in that world, then I think that we have the remedy in our own pockets and in our own checkbooks. Thank you very much for your attention.
China. And the companies that are moving their plants, their producing plants for the labor pools in places like Mexico, Latin America, China, other areas of Southeast Asia. Is this not unofficial foreign aid?
Well, it certainly, I think it has the effect of helping these countries. That's why I think, in a way, the debate about outsourcing that we've had has been a bit unfortunate. And I think the way in which Kerry and Edwards and other Democratic candidates leapt on this issue of outsourcing and sought to rally popular support by saying, American jobs are being sent overseas and that's a bad thing, is actually misconceived. Because I think that if Indians, for example, can do the jobs for less money than our people can and do it well, I think we should think of that as something that is both efficient and beneficial for the US economy, and also conferring a benefit on those countries. Because if Indians think that it's great if they can get a job that pays them $7,000 a year, and they're really happy to work for that, and that puts extra money into the Indian economy, which of course they then spend, and therefore that has other ripple-on effects or trickle-down effects to the rest of the Indian economy, that's an excellent thing. But I wouldn't consider it a form of foreign aid, because each individual corporation that does this is motivated by its own economic benefits. It's not doing it in order to aid those countries, even though it may do so. Of course, if we really did open up our trade completely in the way that I was suggesting, and open up our agricultural markets to developing countries and cease to subsidise, that probably would have actually a bigger effect on their economies and on the poor than, let's say, a doubling or even a tripling of foreign aid. So I would welcome that, and if the US were to do that, instead of increasing foreign aid, I would probably say, well, okay, that's a major contribution, and we could see how that plays out for a while. But I don't think we can get credit simply because corporations take decisions that serve their economic interests. More questions over here? Yeah.
Would you say a word about the money that goes abroad from religious organizations, from Red Cross and other charity and...
Sure. Yeah, I think that money is very important, and I certainly encourage it, and I hope that it should increase. As far as I can tell, in terms of overall quantity, if you're looking at those charts that I put up about the difference between how much Denmark gives as a proportion of its gross domestic product and how much the United States gives, if you add the non-government aid, it doesn't really change the gap between what the US gives and what Denmark gives very significantly. It'll change it a little bit. I think that there is a higher level of non-government aid in this country. But I tried to find out some figures, and the figures that I got suggested that total non-government aid, religious, Red Cross, other sort of secular aid organisations, might amount to close to half of the total government aid. So in other words, remember we had that 0.13, so perhaps you could add another 0.06 to that, and so you get to 0.19 rather than 0.13. Or let's say you get to 0.2, so you get to 20 cents in every $100 going for foreign aid when you add in the private aid, which still doesn't compare well with Denmark's $1 in every $100, or the Netherlands 80 cents in every $100, something of that sort. But it's significant, and as I say, it's, I think, more effective in general than government aid, so it definitely ought to be encouraged. Anyone in the middle block? Yeah.
How would you extend your remarks to that you made about the atmosphere and other natural resources, the oceans for one, but even take diamonds or gold or oil for that matter, because they're all in some sense shared resources, right? Well, the fact that some sheepdom happens to sit on a pile of oil, somehow it doesn't seem right that shared resource should be squandered for miscellaneous purposes, or however it's used.
Yeah, excellent point. I think you need to distinguish slightly. The case about the sea is very similar to the atmosphere. It's a global commons, at least beyond territorial waters. It's a global commons, and it needs to be regulated in the same way. And there has been a sort of convention on the law of the sea, which has done some things, and there are attempts to regulate fishing, although it's very difficult. But that's the closest comparison. The need to in some way regulate fishing because there's a lot of overfishing going on and some fish stocks are collapsing. The more interesting issue, really, I think, is the one about natural resources. Because, you're quite right that if you look at it from a kind of abstract ethical perspective, the fact that, so much of the world's oil happens to be in a particular part of the world doesn't say anything about sort of what's a fair distribution of those resources. And look at it this way too. It often has very deleterious consequences on the nature of those countries. In fact, there's been a lot of a suggestion that resources, an economy that is heavily dependent on natural resources, is more likely to be one that has corrupt government and also a history of military coups and so on. Because if you're, this won't happen everywhere, it'll depend on obviously the conventions of good government. So it won't happen in Australia, although Australia is relatively rich in some minerals, but the traditions of good government are too well entrenched. But if you're in a sort of an African nation that discovers a lot of oil, like Nigeria, or a lot of diamonds, as in out of Congo or something of that sort, you've now suddenly created an enormous financial incentive to take over the country, because there it's pretty clear that if you do take over the country, you will be able to enrich yourself enormously by skimming off some of the revenues from the oil or the diamonds or whatever else they might be. And so there's a real problem here, and there's a question about what can be done about it. I think that one way in which you could do something would be to say, why do we recognise these people as entitled to exploit the natural resources? In other words, if a particular dictator takes over a country, through the fact that he's managed to get the most guys with machine guns who will go along with what he says, why do we then say, okay, so he's now entitled to sell the oil or the diamonds? So the oil companies, whoever they are, go in there and they start negotiating for paying the government huge sums of money in order to get their oil. They surely know that a lot of this oil revenue is not going to go to the people of the country. If anyone is entitled to the oil at all, or to the revenues of the oil, it's the people of that country, or else it's the world as a whole. I mean, that's another possible interesting argument. But certainly, rather than the particular gang of thugs who are in charge of the country, it would be the people as a whole. So I think we should actually have the attitude that we should have put some kind of black mark against corporations that buy resources from dictators, where they know that the money they're paying to the government is not going to go to the benefit of the people. Now, exactly how you do that, how you monitor it, how you then have boycotts against those companies or bring pressure on them in some way not to do this, is a difficult question. But it's not impossible to imagine that happening. Let me just say one more thing about the idea that actually they don't even belong to the people of the country, but in some way they belong to the whole world. I think that also, could well be argued that it's a kind of a lucky fluke that you happen to have oil or diamonds under the soil. What can you do about that? One of my colleagues, a philosopher at the University of Columbia, Columbia University in New York, called Thomas Pogge, has suggested a global resources dividend, as he calls it. So he says, recognising that resources really belong to everyone, any corporations that develop resources, that mine them, should have to pay in a percentage to a global fund which would be like accumulating dividends from the exploitation of resources to be used for the benefit of the world as a whole. And I think that's, in theory, that's an ideal kind of scheme. How you would actually get nations to agree to do it is another question, but there's the theory. Okay, anyone over that side? No, then we'll swing back here, yes.
Do you believe that it's reasonable for any government to actually act in an ethical manner? Or is it all totally self-interest?
Well, do I think it's reasonable? Yes, of course I think that acting ethically is a reasonable thing to do. Do I expect it? That's more complicated. I don't. I wouldn't. I'm not sure what your own view of this, but I know some people say, take a realist view of foreign policy. They say all nations act only in their own interests. But nations have broader and narrower senses of what their own interests are, and some nations may see it as in their own interest to be a good global citizen. After all, we think at a personal level that having self-respect is something that's in your interest. We think that someone who can respect themselves is probably going to actually live a better life, a more satisfying life, a more fulfilling life, a life that has a better kind of tone to it, a more enjoyable way of living your life if you feel you can respect yourself and what you're doing. So why shouldn't citizens of a nation feel the same? They feel better if they can feel proud of their nation, and of course justifiably proud of their nation, for what it's doing in the world. And I think you could see that as part of what's in your national interests. And perhaps the citizens of Denmark or Sweden or the Netherlands think along those lines. They're pleased that their nations are among the leaders in terms of contributing to reducing poverty in some of the poorest countries of the world. So what I see, perhaps the role of people talking about ethics is doing is getting citizens to think this way and to put a bit more weight on that side of the equation that says, look, it's not just a matter of increasing our gross domestic product or maintaining our military superiority or ensuring that we control oil supplies or whatever else it might be. It's also a matter of feeling that we're contributing to making the world a better, safer, prosperous and more humane society.
Just a comment on that. It may be a function of education, because in this country, the leaders talk like we're doing things because they're the ethical thing to do. And as you talked about the kind of perceptions that people have, I think most people in this country kind of have a view of this country as being a beacon of democracy and those kinds of things. So, I mean, that's at least a starting point for getting in the direction of actually behaving ethically, is at least believing that's what they should be.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think a lot of it is education. I think actually Americans are quite idealistic. I think on the whole they're not cynical about their nation. They believe that the nation represents noble ideals, and you often talk, and President Bush talks about the nation's role in promoting freedom and democracy, which is at least suggesting that we're acting for universal goals, not only for our own goals. But I think we do need more education about what we're actually doing in some of these areas where we cannot be so proud of our record. Back over to this side.
Another feature of globalization is the movement of people. I wonder if you could discuss a little bit about some of the immigration controversies in this country, in Europe, and even in Australia.
Yes, well, I'm particularly not proud of Australia's record on that lately, because Australia used to be a country that had a very good record of taking immigrants, and in fact my family came to Australia as refugees from the Nazis. But just lately, the government has really clamped down on that and is taking people who are trying to come as refugees to Australia and putting them in detention camps in the desert while they hear their claims, which can take years. And it may be that they're not all genuine refugees. I mean, that's possible, but I think it's been a very inhumane policy, and they're actually trying to prevent people reaching Australia's shores so that they don't have any claim to make in Australian courts. The United States, in that respect, has generally done rather better than Australia, in that it's been more open to immigrants. It's actually been relatively slack in enforcing its immigration laws. I mean, it's true that it tries to prevent Mexicans getting across the border, but I'm astonished at how openly illegal immigrants can work in this country once they get here. They certainly can't in Australia. You can't, it's very hard to get work if you do manage to get into Australia as an illegal immigrant. It's very hard to find work. You certainly can't have factories, of the sort that exist in this country, where the majority of workers are illegal immigrants, they'd be closed down very rapidly. But looking at the larger ethical issue, I guess one of the questions is, well, should we have open borders? Should we try to, you know, just as we say we have open trade of goods, shouldn't we also have open borders? And that's obviously much more difficult. It's interesting that there's a contrast between NAFTA and the European Union, and that the European Union is a kind of free trade union that not only allows free trade of goods and services across its borders, but does allow relatively free movement of people. There are some restrictions on the 10 nations that are now joining the Eastern European nations, but you know, so they will perhaps gradually only phase in freedom of movement. But within the former nations, you can move across borders. You can work in other countries, and that hasn't happened here. Perhaps because it's felt that it's not politically acceptable. We would have you know, many millions of Mexicans coming across the border to work here. And maybe there is a case for saying that you can't just open up borders because you couldn't cope with the flood of people that would come in. So what you need is some sort of more regulated method of immigration. And as I say, the United States has done reasonably well, I guess, in allowing people in, but I'd like to see other nations do more, particularly in the way of taking refugees, where you can determine people who are real refugees. And I think that the European nations can do more. Some relatively prosperous nations like Japan have a particularly poor record of taking refugees. I think this ought to be something that is done on a larger scale around the world. Gentleman there.
The gap between self-interest and morality is of course very large. Self-interest, you take your own point of view. Morality, you take some kind of neutral point of view. Wouldn't that be an important role for middle ground in two aspects? One is that you could say from the moral point of view, it's not really clear that you should be really fully neutral. You could say, well, everyone has responsibility for themselves and for others, but not an equal share. And there is some kind of middle ground between just self-interest and objective egalitarianism and so on. And also from and even if one, let's say, normatively from the point of view of an ideal conception, one would go with some purely neutral stance, you can still say, well, as a matter of real-world wisdom, there is, to convince people to actually do moral things, you have to develop some kind of second-best ethics.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually agree with that to a large extent. I wouldn't put it in terms of something between morality and realism. I would rather say, as I think you did towards the end, what you might have is a kind of what you hope will be a transitional ethic, or in which you acknowledge local responsibilities as primary, but you give greater weight to responsibilities to the world as a whole, rather than simply moving in one step. I think that for the foreseeable future, we're still going to have national governments which will have primary responsibility for their own citizens. I mean, I certainly think the United States ought to be doing more, let's say, to help, let's say, overcome HIV/AIDS in Africa, but to say that it should be spending as much per victim on HIV/AIDS victims in Africa as it spends on HIV/AIDS victims in the United States is, I think, goes too far, at least for the moment. So I think we should be working towards if you like, a less sharp difference between the concern that we have for interests of our fellow citizens and the concern we have for people everywhere in the world, rather than trying to move immediately to what might be a kind of ideal morality level of equal concern. Okay, well, maybe just take one or two more questions. There's two hands in the middle block. Let's take the gentleman with the beard first. Yes. Yeah.
I agree with you that the Bush administration policy on global warming is of at least questionable ethics, and in my opinion, it's probably the same. But I do think it's important to keep in mind that, according to Jeffrey Sachs and many other economists, 50 years from now, the economy of China, the GDP of China will be equal to what that of the United States will be 50 years from now. And most likely that would be true of India as well. So at that time, however much output and pollution the United States is producing, the three countries, US, India, and China, will be producing 3 times as much. And given that, would you agree that, and if that happens, many of the dire predictions that people are making that we described about what will happen to enormous numbers of poor people living in coastal areas and so on will be a lot closer to happening.
Yeah.
Given that, would you agree that it would be fair and appropriate for the world community to insist that China and India gradually reduce the amount of pollution per unit of output that they make over, let's say, the next 50 years?
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, that the international community insists that the developed world make some very significant reductions now.
Yeah, certainly. I think it was always intended. I mean, it's not exactly spelled out in the Kyoto Protocol, but I think it was always intended that the developed countries would be the first to make these cuts, and the developing countries would come on board in some future time period. I think probably in a lot less than 50 years, maybe in 10 or 20 years. The parallel here is the Montreal Convention, which controlled the fluorocarbons that damage the ozone layer, where the developed nations were the first to agree to cuts, but the developing nations quite rapidly matched or joined, so that now they've almost entirely phased out production of CFCs as well. I think they were running about 10 years behind the developed nations on that. So yes, certainly the same sort of thing would have to happen. I didn't really have time to go into it a lot, but one way in which you could do this would be by giving every nation a quota and allowing nations that don't use up their quota to market it, to sell it to nations that have excess quota. So that what that would do is it would give China and India an incentive to do exactly what you said, that is to reduce the output of greenhouse gases per unit of production, to make themselves more efficient, because that way they could have development but still keep under their quota and have some quota to sell to nations, developed nations that are trying to cut back. So that would give them a kind of a market mechanism to give them an incentive to be efficient. And right behind you there was a question.
I just had one question. You were talking about international law. Would you feel that the U.S. Constitution and laws should be subordinated to international law by this treaty?
Well, the U.S. Constitution recognizes the power of the U.S. government to sign on to treaties. I mean, it includes that provision for treaties to be ratified by the Senate. So I would say that it's compatible with that if the Senate ratifies treaties, those treaties become the law of the land. Now, if you're saying, well, suppose that there were a ratification of a treaty which conflicted with other clauses of the US Constitution, I suppose that would then mean that the Supreme Court would have to adjudicate on whether there was such a conflict and whether the conflict was so serious that the treaty could not be signed onto. That's a possibility. You would need to know then exactly what that was and how it was. And conceivably, if there was something that was held to be in conflict with the US Constitution, but was something that was an important issue for the rest of the world, then maybe an amendment to the US Constitution would have to be contemplated. If what we're in the end talking about is some sort of global political decision process that has some powers anyway, obviously not all the powers of national governments, maybe an amendment is required, and maybe once you get far enough down the track, you would have support for that. I agree that at the moment you obviously would not. All right, I think perhaps we should leave it.